I start then with some anecdotes. One which is quite personal. Back in the 1980s, I was a member of the International Socialist Group, which was formed out of a split from the International Marxist Group. And one of the things which the group supposed that it was going to do better was in terms of openness and related matters. Now, I provided for their journal International a review of Tom Nairn's book, The Enchanted Glass, about the British monarchy. And a couple of months later, I offered to follow that up with a critique from the standpoint of a constitutional lawyer, because I had been teaching constitutional law between 1982 and 1985, of why the Militants Enabling Act project of obtaining socialism through a left Labour government passing an enabling act to give itself powers to rule by decree wasn't a project which would work as a political project. Yes, my review of Nairn was published in International, but the critique of Militant on the Enabling Act, International refused to publish. And the explanation which they gave of why International refused to publish it was that although it was targeted as a critique of Militant, it was in fact implicitly a critique of the ISG's allies in the Labour left, who also shared the idea that a left Labour government could introduce socialism by a series of acts of legislation. So in this case, the ISG's alliance policy required it to operate a political censorship of its own press, not merely of opponent people, but of supporters of the organization who said something which turned out would be inconvenient from the point of view of spin in relation to the organization's alliance policy, its broad front policy in relation to the quote Benite left. Next story, respect. In the respect the Unity Coalition in the 2000s, the SWP, Socialist Workers' Party, who were running the show of this, largely running the show of this Unity Coalition, were extraordinarily keen to avoid political discussion in the localities and sent round circulars saying that what the localities should be doing was not having political discussions which would turn people off, but having parties, socials, but some organizing meetings to organize public leafleting and stuff like that. Political discussion was a no-no because it would turn people off. And the SWP indeed were the gatekeepers of right-wingness in relation to of the right, as it were, of respect. John Rees telling us, I can't remember on which occasion, that the job of respect was to speak for the voiceless millions who were excluded from political representation by the Blairite domination of the Labour Party, and that for that reason we shouldn't indulge ourselves by defending the political positions, which are political positions of the SWP, which of course the SWP formerly shared with groups to its left. It was an interesting phenomenon. This, I think, is not necessarily generalized, but SWP canvassers in Oxford, my own view and that of other comrades coming from the Stop the War Coalition into Respect, was that canvassing for Respect, the right way to present is we're the anti-war party. But the SWP weren't keen on that. Their view was we should canvass on the basis, if we say we're Respect, we're ex-Labour Party members who are not happy with the way in which the Blair administration has moved to the right, which was a load of bollocks apart from anything else, because the proportion of ex-Labour Party members who were pissed off by Blair's move to the right in Respect was completely trivial. And the people who were saying this were in fact long-standing SWP members. Interestingly, in this context, the brief life of the Galloway version, Galloway-led Respect, the Galloway wing of Respect, after the SWP split from Respect, moved to the left. It took up more left-wing positions on the constitutional-related issues than the SWP had been willing to allow to be voted through. Thirdly, TUSC, the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition. We were told, I can't remember exactly when we were told, the RMT, the Rail Maritime Transport Union, is represented on its leadership and has a veto over anything that it might do. That's all of these things are instances of unity seems to require, the sort of unity that people are proposing seems to require a bureaucratic centralism. There are broader examples which I have less personal familiarity with. So in this country, yes, it is Bob Crow's time at the top of RMT. The Fourth International Supporters Caucus in the Socialist, in Scargill's Socialist Labour Party functioned as bureaucratic gatekeepers against, quote, far left, unquote, entry in the Socialist Labour Party. The short-lived Liverpool-based trade union, the United Socialist Party, was a United Socialist Party which excluded organised groups. And again, the exclusion of organised groups led to this being a organisation which was characterised by witch hunting throughout its life. Going beyond Britain, Democracia Socialista, I have no idea how to pronounce Portuguese, so I'm almost certainly pronouncing that wrong. Democracia Socialista in Brazil was the gatekeepers against the left in the Brazilian Workers' Party. It's C, Democracia Socialista, I don't know, anyhow, was the gatekeepers against the left in the other Trotskyists in the Brazilian Workers' Party, and supporters fairly consistently, mildly critical supporters of the Lula leadership against criticisms which were offered by other varieties of Trotskyism. The end of this story was that when the Lula leadership formed a government, which was a coalition government with unequivocally bourgeois parties, which became notoriously corrupt, and this is the background of current Brazilian politics, but it's Lula was ultimately jailed on dodgy corruption charges, but and acquitted of them. But in essence, the government, no doubt whatever, that the government was a corrupt coalition with the capitalist class. The Fourth International, the Mandelite Fourth International, finally broke with this project, and it turned out that the majority of Democracia Socialista went with Lula rather than go with the Mandelites. Sinistra Critica, the critical left in the Italian Rifondazione, was again the Mandelite organization in Italy. I can't remember, it had originally been called the Gruppi Comunisti Rivoluzionari, and had passed through various incarnations before winding up as Sinistra Critica. Sinistra Critica was the soft critics of the leadership of Rifondazione Comunista. They too wound up finally having to break with the leadership of Rifondazione Comunista at a moment at which actually Rifondazione Comunista had exploded into pieces, which turned out to be just gravel. Nothing is left of the what was a very strong, really strong Italian, very strong Italian far left. That what's left is political gravel. And the reality is that, okay, it may well be the case that the Worker Communist Party, etc., the Communist Workers' Party, I can't remember what the thing's called, the Communist Workers' Party, the Franco Grisolia et al. Organization, is sectarian in character, but at the same time, the Sinistra Critica's diplomatic approach to the leadership of Rifondazione and its hypercritical approach to the Trotskyist left critics of the leadership of Rifondazione has ended up with producing sweet fuck all for Sinistra Critica. And the Mandelites themselves, in fact, have self-criticized in relation to both these individual cases of the DS in Brazil and the Sinistra Critica in Rifondazione. They've recognized that something went wrong, but willingness to recognize that something went wrong which goes beyond just the individual cases, that they got something wrong in these individual cases, remains absent. I don't think those are by any means the only examples. I'm sure they aren't the only examples. I've given these examples partly because as an ex-Mandelite, I am more familiar. I follow more the publications and conduct of the Mandelites in politics. So the question is, where does this practice of diplomatic cozying up to the right and attempted suppression of criticisms from the left as an alleged condition of broad frontism come from, of unity, and this is the broad front conception of unity. Where does this come from, and is it logically inherent in the broad front conception of unity that you should wind up with this sort of diplomacy to your right and cracking down to your left? So, Ollie, if we could move to the next slide. What I'm talking about is quote, transitional method and quote, transitional organization. I'm not talking about quote, transitional demands or a quote, transitional program. The transitionalism, the proof text is this, one of the famous proof texts is this line from the Trotsky's transitional program, the death agony of capitalism and the task of the Fourth International. It's necessary to help the masses in the process of the daily struggle to find the bridge between present demands and the socialist program of the revolution. This bridge should include a system of transitional demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class, and unalterably leading to one final conclusion, the conquest of power by the proletariat. Okay, so this is a concept of, as it stands, of a set of demands which make a linkage between present day demands and the conquest of power by the proletariat, and of a program which makes a linkage between present day demands and the conquest of power by the proletariat. It's important to be clear that what Trotsky means by the conquest of power by the proletariat is Soviets and war communism, full nationalization of everything and directive central planning as the immediate, as the necessary, and in a sense, it's probably the case that it is actually necessary to move in the case of overthrowing the political power of the bourgeoisie, because the bourgeoisie will immediately seek to sabotage any political power which it doesn't itself control. There is an urgent need to move to rationing, state controls, directive central planning, in the same way as war or plague necessarily require very extensive state intervention. But nonetheless, it's important to be clear that this is Trotsky's conception is a program which links immediate demands and the wages struggle and the struggle against unemployment and such like questions to Soviets on the one hand and to generalized expropriations and rationing on the other hand. Now, that is not what broad frontism makes of transitionalism, what frontism makes of transitionalism is to extract from this formulation the idea of the program which links, or the concrete demands which link the immediate class struggle to Soviets and but more particularly actually to the economic overthrow of capital and the expropriation of the proletariat laying collective hands on the forces of production in the form of war communism. Yeah. Because generally speaking, post-war Trotskyists have taken the view that this has no purchase, this particular line has no or very little purchase on reality. And I don't think that they're wrong to say that this particular line has very little purchase on reality. My personal view, this is going step back. The transitional demands idea comes up in the fourth Congress of the Comintern. My understanding of what it's doing is it's doing two things, one of which is the Germans trying to dodge around the unpopularity of the Russian political regime in the German workers' movement by focusing on economic demands which they have in common with the majority socialists and the majority socialists. The other is the Russians fudging the difference between Bukharin, who argued for the abolition of the minimum program, and Lenin and Trotsky, who were arguing, or Lenin in particular, was arguing for the retention of the minimum program. And transition demands linking in with the Germans' ideas allowed them to fudge this question. However, that I described that stuff. What the Trotskyists, post-1945 Trotskyists, are doing is something fairly radically different from that. It's taking the idea of a linkage between socialism and demands stemming from today's conditions and from today's consciousness of wide layers of the working class, and leading not to the conquest of power by the proletariat in the sense of Soviets in the full sense plus generalized expropriations and war communism, but to militancy, mass action, broader strikes, and thence in the direction of the creation of Soviets, of workers' councils. Ollie, can we have the third slide, please? There's a second feed in, which relates to the Trotskyists and the official communists / Stalinists in the 1930s. And the context of this is the background. The Trotskyists were a faction which was an external or expelled faction, or sometimes an internal faction in the official communist parties down to 1933. When the KPD in Germany, the German Communist Party, proved to be incapable of organizing resistance to the Hitler coup, and indeed utterly failed to do anything, and the Comintern itself indeed failed to do anything, Trotsky issued a call along with the Trotskyist opposition as a public faction, issued a call along with a number of other organizations called the Declaration of Four, saying that the Comintern was dead and calling for a new international. Now, the argument had been the Comintern is dead because it totally failed to implement any united front policy towards the German Socialist Party, or the Austrian Socialist Party for that matter, through which the organized resistance to fascism could take place. But of course, the Comintern proved to be capable of taking a zigzag in exactly the opposite direction. And in 1935, the 7th Congress of the Comintern does exactly that, and turns to a new conception of the United Front and the idea of the People's Front, of an alliance of the working class with the democratic bourgeoisie against fascism. The part about the Popular Front is of less immediate concern to us, but the concept of the United Front which Dimitrov expresses in his speech on the fascist offensive and the tasks of the Comintern in 1935, is fundamental because it's become adopted by almost all Trotskyists, people ostensible, let's call them ostensible Trotskyists, but also much wider left forces. So the communists attack us is the socialists say we can't have a united front with the communists because communists attack us. But listen, says Dimitrov, we've repeatedly declared we shall not attack anyone, whether persons, organizations or parties, standing for the united front against the working class, against the class enemy. But at the same time, it is our duty in the interest of the proletariat and its cause to criticize those persons, organizations and parties that hinder unity of action by the workers. So this was a decisive break from the conceptions of the United Front at the third and fourth Congresses of Comintern and the International Executive Committee, because the conceptions of the United Front of the early Comintern had essentially said, we are for unity in action on the basis of complete freedom of criticism, and that there should be freedom of criticism which extends to us allowing to say to the right wing, your position is scabby. Just as in relation to the Labour Party question, Lenin insists that it's fundamental to his orientation in relation to the Labour Party question. It should be that it's permissible and that you can get away with saying that the Labour leadership are class traitors and scabs. No compromise is possible on giving up the right of freedom of criticism. And the reason for that, of course, is because if you give up the right of freedom of criticism, you've accepted what the majority Social Democrats did when they expelled the Independent Socialist Party in 1916, the right of the majority Social Democrats, because they're in alliance with the state, to dictate the forms of what can and what can't be said within the politics of the workers' movement. Ollie, next slide, please. Trotsky's position is the transitional program position / transitional demands position. It's not the transitional method position. And we can see that, in fact, because there's a whole group of people who broke with Trotsky over precisely the question of what's your attitude to the question of unification on the basis of diplomatic agreements, which preclude disagreement, open criticism. It's the post-war Trotskyist literature on this stuff muddles this tendency up really dramatically. The reason why it does so is because Pierre Franck of La Commune became a central leader of the Mandelite Fourth International, and the consequence then is that this tendency cannot be seen as a whole. In essence, it's a tendency of groups of people who accepted who were Trotskyists by background, but accepted the Dimitrov conception of left unity. And the four groups I've identified, there's probably more. I think it's probably also true of the Archives of Marxism group in Greece. But the PUM is the most famous, the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista of Andrew Nin and others. The RSAP of the Netherlands, led by Henk Snevliet. The tendency La Commune, the paper La Commune and its Parti Communiste Internationaliste, founded by Molinier and Frank, and Georges Verreken, who split who led a split from the Belgian Trotskyist organization, which then unified with a left socialist trend called to form the Parti Socialiste Révolutionnaire of Belgium. So Trotsky broke with all these people precisely over this question of, do you form unity on the basis of diplomacy, or do you form unity on the basis of common action on common ground, but the insistence on the right to have sharp, open political differences, so that that background is telling us something about what was meant by the passage in the transitional program, which is the proof text for Trotskyist advocates of broad frontism. Next slide, please. Okay, what we're concerned with in broad frontism is the idea that we have to start with the present consciousness of the masses, that we have to raise demands and so on. We start with the present consciousness of the masses, and that by raising demands and organizing fights around present consciousness of the masses, we're going to get a process of radicalization which will take place. Yeah. And what this actually is a left-wing version of triangulation. Triangulation, the political triangulation, the expression is, as this text from the political dictionary says, Clinton Easter, comes from Dick Morris, and the idea was we can, by maneuvering ourselves into a position which stands between the positions of the traditional positions of the Democratic Party and the traditional positions of the Republican Party, we can capture the left wing of the Republican vote, as it were, and thereby we can win power. Okay, we can win office. No doubt you can win office on this basis. The same, in essence, the politics of Blairism is closely associated with this. But what we're doing with transitionalism is doing triangulation between the ideas of communism on the one hand and the ideas of the loyalist social democracy, the loyalist, or we could say communism, or we could equally say revolutionary social democracy as per pre-1914, but we're doing triangulation between that trend on the one hand and on the other hand loyalist social democracy of the sort which existed from 1914 onwards. And there's a problem with this. Ollie, next slide, please. This is an American political cartoon about actually, although it's presented as this is the operation of triangulation, the right wing say, let's meet in the middle, and the left moves over to the right. The right now moves over further right and says, let's meet in the middle. That is to say that triangulation drags you right because it hands over, precisely because it addresses where people are, but where people actually are, as in the center, whether it's in the center between the proper right wing and the left, or it's in the center between the loyalist social democracy and the left. Actually, you're setting up the conditions for a ratchet movement to the right, because what the right say is what's, as far as the right is concerned, that what's theirs is theirs and what's ours is theirs, and nothing which is short of the BBC, which is 66% biased in favour of the Conservative Party, is said to be biased against the Conservative Party because it ought to be biased 90% in favour of the Conservative Party. But the same's true in relation to the logic of movement of the left, and we can see this again in the evolution of the Labour left. If we look at the believers in Corbynism imagine that the 2017 and 2019 manifestos are radical left-wing manifestos. But the reality is the 2017 and 2019 manifestos leave intact 90% of Thatcherism. They are manifestos which are written within the framework of Blairism, of not touching the fundamentals of the anti-union laws, not touching the fundamentals of rate capping and the control of local authority housing budgets, and so on, and so on, and so on. That the Labour right has moved to the right. That was visible in Blairism. And then the consequence is that the Labour left, seeking to triangulate with the Labour right, has moved to the right within that framework. Next slide, please. Going along with triangulation is the need to make sure that everybody is, quote, on message. Again, this is US political management technique, and this one is more recent text, but it's from an American George Washington University's online Masters in Political Management online. It becomes necessary because of what you're doing is you're trying to make sure that your message gets through to the centre ground voters. In order to make sure that your message gets through to the centre ground voters, it's necessary to suppress, to control anything which is off message, anything which is potentially embarrassing to you. You don't want to have Gordon Brown saying what a bigoted woman on air in the 2010 election. Or any of this stuff. You need, therefore, to have really tight media control. Next slide, please. And by the mid-2000s, it was completely apparent to everybody that this was happening in the Blair administration, and hence I've given you a couple of references for the relationship between news management on the one hand and Blairite control freakery, etc., on the other hand. That logic is also very unambiguously the logic that was going on in Respect. And exactly the same modes of reasoning, in fact, we have from John Rees. I cannot remember at which Respect conference it was. We have to be the voice of the unrepresented, who are unrepresented because of Blairism, and because we have to be the voice of the unrepresented, who are unrepresented because of Blairism, we can't indulge ourselves in putting forward, in the name of respect, demands which the SWP might happen to agree with, because these will dilute the clarity of Respect's message. This goes back a long way. Cliff and Gluckstein on the Labour Party talk about the success of Chartism as being attributable to, quote, moderate demands and militant action. There's a bizarre aspect to this, because the idea that universal suffrage was, even male suffrage was which was what the Chartists demanded, was a moderate demand in the 1840s is bizarre, but it looks like it if you look back without significant knowledge of 19th century history. Yeah, Nixon and Agnew's silent majority, but the silent majority we have, Tony Blair also talks about the silent majority. Neil Kinnock talked about the unrepresented majority. John Rees talks about the unrepresented majority. Tony Greenstein, in his latest piece in the Weekly Worker, pieces in the Weekly Worker, talk about, and on his blog, I talk about the Labour Left Alliance Labour Against Witch Hunt / Labour in Exile network as potentially organising the 150,000 people who have dropped Labour Party membership. I'm sorry, this is 100-odd comrades. You don't represent anything other than yourselves. It's no use saying we are going to organise on the basis of the 2017 or the 2019 manifesto, because that will appeal to all the tens of thousands of people who've left the Labour Party because of the defeat of Corbynism. You don't represent that voiceless, those voiceless tens of thousands. You represent only yourselves. And then finally, final slide. We don't have to have this controlling exercise through the controlling the mechanisms of control, the Blairite direct methods of control, or for that matter, the SWP's straightforwardly Stalinist, bureaucratic, centralist, indeed more severely bureaucratic, centralist than official communist organizations' methods of top-down bureaucratic control. We can equally do it through, quote, traditional labour movement procedure, because traditional labour movement procedure has two elements, one of which is that we directly elect officers, and the officers then have autonomy in their fiefs. We've elected them in a quasi-monarchical or Bonapartistic sense, in the same way that direct election of the President of the United States or a party leader makes them autonomous from the leading committee, which is elected. But secondly, also, we have a whole set of rules derived, even if you're using Wall-Hannington, sorry, I'll put Wall-Hannington in the chat. Even if you're using Wall-Hannington's manual of chairmanship, it's actually derived from Walter Citrine's ABC of chairmanship, written originally, in fact, before the First World War, republished in the form in which it now exists in 1920 as the Labour chairman, and then in 1939 as the ABC of chairmanship, in which it continues to exist. Where does this come from? First off, it's based on the procedural rules of Parliament and those of local government and those of companies. These rules are all designed, in fact, in the case of Parliament and to avoid decisions being taken without the agreement of the management, whether the management is the government in Parliament or the council leadership in local authorities or the board of directors in companies. These are rules of decision making, and they're a set of procedural rules. You have to have procedural rules. You can't do without procedural rules and just have consensus or chaos and anarchy, because actually then everybody talks at the same time and you get no decision making taken at all. But you have to have procedural rules, but these are procedural rules which are slanted in the interests of non-decision making. And they're slanted in the interests of non-decision making as far as Parliament is concerned, because that leaves the property owners free to decide that the property owners are not going to be subjected to inconvenient decisions by Parliament. And in the case of companies and local government, same, but in the case of companies, because it's convenient for the management to be able to run the show without too much interference from the shareholders. And Citrine, of course, we should also note, was a violent anti-communist and one of the leaders of the right wing in the labour movement. So these traditional labour movement procedural rules are not neutral. They are rules to secure the dictatorship of the bureaucracy. So adopting traditional labour movement procedural rules, on the one hand, is a concession to the right wing. It's part of the broad frontist project of triangulation in itself, that we're saying, okay, we're not going to challenge the way in which the labour movement has traditionally done things, which is in fact under the dictatorship of the labour bureaucracy, which in turn actually subordinates itself. And Citrine is ultra visible that Lord Citrine subordinates himself to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and subordinates the trade union movement, the labour movement, to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie through these rules. But it's also the case that the traditional labour movement procedural rules are a means by which we can control what is heard and thereby ensure, quote, on message, and by ensuring on message, be able to triangulate, which is what we're doing when we're doing, quote, transitional method, as opposed to the ideas of transitional program or transitional demands. So I've been on for 40 minutes now. Essentially, I've said what I'm going to say. It's inherent in the idea of the broad frontism that we have to, that there's a dynamic to the right, rather than the dynamic, the transitional organization, quote, transitional organization, dragging people to the left. It drags the initiators and leaders to the right. Its proof texts in Trotsky are not defensible, and it also automatically, logically carries with it the need for bureaucratic control. It doesn't matter whether that bureaucratic control takes the form of SWP-style Stalinism, Blairite control freakery, or the organizational methods of the right-wing trade union bureaucracy as expressed in Citrine on chairmanship and associated matters. So that's all I have to say. And yeah, Ollie, you can stop the screen share now. Thanks.